In this box is an exact copy of one of the most iconic lenses ever made. I'm really excited by it. If you want to know what it is, keep watching. Well, hey everybody, thank you for checking in once again and welcome to another one. Here is today's lens. It's from TT Artisan and it's their 75mm f1.5 manual focusing lens, and this lens is an exact copy of the Carl Zeiss Jena Biotar 75mm f1.5 of the 19s, the original swirler. It makes beautiful bokeh in the back of a shot that seems to move and seems to swirl. This is a very, very interesting lens that I must admit I've been waiting to shoot for some considerable time. It's an exact copy of the Biotar, except it has two high index glass elements. So it's brought up to date. It's brought up to date with 5mm Biotar. That's a very famous lens in its own right, and I will be comparing the Helios 40 to this lens a little bit today as we talk about its qualities. Its original CZJ Biotar 75mm, assuming you could find a good one in good working condition, you're looking at thousands of pounds or dollars. I had a little look online and prices of £3,000, £4,000 are not entirely unheard of. So it's in original form, it's an expensive lens. The Helios 40 that is derived from it, that can be found for around about £350 or $269. That's nice for people in the USA. It means you get it just that little bit cheaper, but even so, wherever you are, at £269 or dollars, this is a very, very cheap way into the Biotar experience. So here is the lens, and my gosh, you can see that lovely big front element there, and we've got greeny shortly. It's a fairly heavy lens. It weighs around about 600 grams, so there's a fair bit of weight to it. I didn't find it too much to carry around all day, but you do know that you're carrying a heavy lens around. In shape, it has something of the look of the Helios 44, not the 40 85mm, but the shorter 58mm. It does have something of the look of that, but it's much, much more nicely made. The Helios lenses are all nicely enough, but they don't quite have the tightness that this one has. This one is really beautifully made. Here's the aperture ring. It turns very, very smoothly. It's got half stops, f16. At the rear of the lens we have an M42 mount, and that really is fantastic. It means it will adapt to any mirrorless camera, and it will also mount on hundreds of film cameras as well. So there's the M42 thread mount. That really is a universal mount still all this time after its introduction. I'll show you the aperture blades. There are 13 blades in this lens. Can we see them there? There we are. Round bokeh balls, at least in the center of the shot, should be that shortly. So a beautiful big aperture and a really, really nicely finished lens. It has a very premium feel, and there is no hint of sort of cheap feeling at all about this lens. It's just very, very nicely made. Everything's engraved. The body finish is in this nice sort of matte black finish. It's a very, very nicely made and finished lens. Much has been said, written and otherwise communicated about the background blur that this lens can make. It's spectacular. It looks like a painting. It's just astonishing, and it emerges very, very 85mm lens that's readily available. You do have to get those distances right for blur to emerge, but with this one the blur is there pretty much as soon as you put it on the camera, more or less at any relation of distances between camera, subject and background, unless of course you shoot it. It can look like a painting. It's just astonishing. And if you want a really, really beautiful aesthetic effect in the back of your shot, this lens will most certainly give it to you. Point light sources in the back of a shot, when you're shooting wide open, in the center of a shot they are circular, perfectly round, nice and circular. But if you go towards the edges of the shot and the corners, in fact not that far out from the center this effect begins, then those round bokeh balls take on a sort of a cat's eye shape. They become a little squashed and elongated, and the nearer to the edges, the more this cat's eye shape seems to take over. It's when we're just dealing with, you know, ordinary sort of objects in everyday life in the background, they too take. I know is not for everyone, but I've got to admit, I absolutely love it. I think it's a beautiful effect, and it really livens up a shot as far as I'm concerned. The blur in this one, that's a really wild lens. It just pretty much does as it pleases wide open. There's little rhyme or reason to it, and you do need to be fairly careful to get those distances right. That craziness of the Helios is spectacular, just as spectacular as the Helios, but much better behaved, much tidier, much nicer and much more coherent. That blur persists when you stop the lens down, but the cat's eye shapes become less and less cat's eyes, less and less elliptical, and more circular as you stop the lens down. That happens at the edges, so that by the time you've got to, I don't know, f5.6 or f8 or thereabouts, bubbles from point light sources are generally all circular across the frame, so you lose the fantastic swirliness, though of course you do gain in sharpness. I've got to admit though, I just shot it wide open because I just love what it can do, wide identity. Colour from this one is not particularly saturated, but they are very solid, very definite. They have a very definite presence, and the lens seems to emphasize blues and green. Lens, I certainly wouldn't call it a warm lens. I think it's best characterized as a coolish sort of lens. But generally I love what this lens does with colour. So loud and in your face. Colours are lively, energetic, got a very definite presence and character, and I think generally speaking this lens handles colours very well indeed. As for sharpness, well, it's sharp in the centre. It's very soft wide open, very soft indeed, and it's really so soft that it is difficult to shoot it wide open because you do get a little bit of a soft and mushy image from it. But this one is different. This one, wide open in the centre, has an area of sharpness that is considerably better than the Helios. It's not quite as sharp as the modern autofocus lenses that you can buy. It does have that little hint of softness wide open, but that makes it nice for portraits because you end up with a sharply and nicely defined subject surrounded by frame, and by f8 it really is very sharp, though of course you lose almost 100-year-old lens. It's a very old design, so yeah, it does vignette. Inevitably it vignettes when it's wide open. It's not horrendous, it's not as bad as this one. Does have some dark corners. Like all lenses, they get lighter as you stop down, and by f8 the corners are nice and light and bright, but I don't think the vignetting is too heavy from this one. I think it's perfectly fine to shoot wide open all the time, and if you don't like a touch of vignetting, then you can easily remove that in post. There is a little green and purple fringing from this one. It does have a little bit of chromatic aberration. It's not awful, it's not dreadful, and it's certainly not as bad as many other, even wide open, but it is there and you will see it if you are shooting against a very bright background like the sky. That gets better, that performance gets better as you stop down, and it's much reduced by f8. So in summary then, a very, very interesting lens from TT Artisan lens. It's a very, very nice, very well made recreation of a legendary optical formula straight from the 1930s, but with modern high index glass elements added to bring it up and film photographer, and I think it's done that really, really well. I congratulate any manufacturer who is bringing back recreations of iconic old lenses of the past, and in fact I can think about, for example, a recreation of the Carl Zeiss Jena Pancolar 80mm f1.8. That's a beautiful, beautiful lens just waiting to be reproduced by somebody. Or a more ordinary lens, a Jupiter 8, a copy of the 1930s Fed 10 collapsible. That would be a fantastic copy to see too. I do hope we see more copies of lenses like this. I've very much enjoyed shooting it. It's a really accessible lens and it brings that ultimate swirly experience way down in price, so that, you know, it really is an accessible optic now. So that's about it from me for now. Thank you very much for watching. I do appreciate everybody who tunes in, and if you've enjoyed, many thanks to subscribers for your support. I do appreciate everybody who has subscribed. Thank you for that, and many thanks go to patrons for your support. I really do appreciate your support and it's very much valued, so thank you for that. Thank you to everybody all. As from me, that is it for now. But if you're not doing anything too irksome, troubling or bothersome next week at around this time, please do tune in for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.